The air in the abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Ikeja hung thick with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid smoke of gunfire. Sirens screamed in the distance, a mournful chorus drawing closer to the chaotic tableau. Sprawled against a stack of crates, his immaculate white Igbata now a canvas of crimson, was Chief Obafemi Adebayo. The titan of Lagosian shipping, the philanthropist whose name was whispered like a prayer in the city's poorest slums, was dying. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps, each one a losing battle against the inevitable. His eyes, once commanding and sharp, were now clouded with a pain that transcended the physical wound in his abdomen. The first to reach him was not a paramedic, but a man whose presence signified a different kind of end. Detective Ibrahim, a lanky, weary figure in a rumpled suit, knelt beside the fallen magnate. His face, etched with the cynicism of a man who had seen the city's underbelly too many times, was a mask of grim professionalism. He had spent years chasing the phantoms behind a string of audacious, high-level robberies that had plagued Lagos's elite. He never imagined the trail would end at the feet of the city's most beloved benefactor. Chief Adebayo, Ibrahim's voice was low, steady. "Can you tell me who did this?" Adebayo's lips trembled, a faint, gurgling sound escaping. He wasn't looking at the detective, his gaze was turned inward, to a place of final, desperate reckoning. Detective Aliyu Ibrahim was a man unmoved by wealth. He saw the gleaming towers of Victoria Island not as symbols of success, but as monuments to greed, often built on foundations of corruption he could never fully excavate. He had been on the force for 25 years, long enough to know that saints and sinners often shopped at the same high-end boutiques. When the call came in about a shootout involving Chief Adebayo, he assumed the man was a victim, another casualty of the city's endemic violence. Yet, something about the initial reports felt off, the precision, the location, the whispers of an inside job. As he knelt in the dust and grime, the dying man's aura of power was gone, replaced by a raw, human fragility. Ibrahim had attended Adebayo's charity galas, had watched him on television cutting ribbons for new schools in impoverished districts, had even felt a grudging respect for his apparent generosity. Now, seeing him here, in the squalor of a criminal's end, Ibrahim felt a familiar knot of suspicion tighten in his gut. He was prepared for a deathbed accusation, a name of a business rival, a political enemy. He was not prepared for the name that Adebayo would actually utter, nor the prayer that would follow, a plea that would shatter the city's most cherished myth. Adebayo's eyes fluttered, finding a sliver of focus. He ignored the detective's question, his mind consumed by a singular, urgent purpose. A bloody hand reached out, not in a plea for help, but to grip Ibrahim's arm with surprising strength. "Funk," he rasped, the name a shard of glass in his throat. "Tell Funk. God, tell her to forgive me." The raw agony in his voice caught Ibrahim off guard. It wasn't the sound of a man fearing judgment for his own soul, but of one terrified for another's. His prayer was not for heaven, but for absolution from a person the detective had never heard of. The surrounding officers, now cautiously securing the scene, exchanged confused glances. Who was Funk? A secret lover? A daughter hidden from the public eye? The name meant nothing to them. To Ibrahim, however, it was the first thread. In his experience, a dying man's last words were often the most honest. They were the key. "Who is Funk, Chief?" Ibrahim pressed gently, his professional curiosity overriding his shock. Adebayo's head lolled back. "My maid," he whispered, the admission costing him dearly. "My good, loyal, girl. She knew nothing. It was all me." The confession hung in the air, thick and unbelievable, as the great Chief Adebayo's last prayer was for the forgiveness of his help. Miles away, in the serene, manicured grounds of the Adebayo estate in Ikoyi, Funk adjusted the white orchids on the grand dining table. Her brow was furrowed with a mild, maternal worry. The chief was late. He was never late without calling. For 10 years, she had managed his household with a quiet efficiency that had earned her his complete trust and affection. He wasn't just an employer, he was a benefactor, a father figure who had lifted her from the brink of poverty and treated her with a dignity she had never known. She owed him everything. She straightened a gold-framed photograph on the mantelpiece, Chief Adebayo shaking hands with the governor, a wide, benevolent smile on his face. That was the man she knew. The man who funded her younger brother's university education and paid for their mother's cataract surgery without a second thought. She had just returned from the bank, having made the weekly deposits for what the chief called his special projects, various charitable accounts for orphanages and community outreach programs. The large sums of cash never fazed her, she simply saw them as a testament to his immense generosity, a river of wealth flowing from a good man's heart to those in need. Her world was orderly, secure, and built on the foundation of his kindness. A foundation that was, at that very moment, crumbling into dust and blood. Back in the warehouse, the weight of Adebayo's words settled upon Detective Ibrahim. "Your maid," he repeated, ensuring his ears hadn't deceived him amidst the cacophony of approaching sirens. Adebayo gave a weak, affirmative nod, a tear tracing a clean path through the grime on his cheek. "My empire, the shipping company, the grants. It's all a lie, detective," he choked out, his voice a horrifying whisper. "Every naira. It's blood money. Stolen. All of it." Ibrahim stared, his mind refusing to connect the dots. Chief Adebayo, the philanthropist of the year, a violent thief? It was preposterous. For 30 years, Adebayo continued, his confession now a torrent, as if a lifetime of pressure was being released. "I led a team. We chose the targets. The corrupt politicians, the tax-evading businessmen, the ones who bled the country dry. We took it back." He coughed, a spray of blood dotting Ibrahim's suit. "It was supposed to be for them. For the poor. To build something real." The detective felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. This wasn't just a crime, it was a mythology, a dark, twisted version of the very public persona Adebayo had crafted. The hero of the slums was a kingpin, and his entire legacy was a carefully constructed fraud. To understand the monster, one had to see the boy. Obafemi Adebayo was born not in a palace, but in the floating slum of Makoko, where houses stood on stilts above the black, polluted waters of the Lagos Lagoon. His childhood was a relentless tapestry of poverty. He watched his sister die from cholera because they couldn't afford clean water or basic medicine. He saw his father, a proud fisherman, humiliated and broken by corrupt officials who demanded bribes he could not pay. The stench of decay and the quiet desperation of his people were the defining sensations of his youth. It was on the day his sister was buried, a small bundle wrapped in white cloth, that the vow was made. He was 15, rail-thin but with eyes that burned with a cold fire. He looked across the lagoon at the distant, glittering lights of Ikoyi and saw not a city, but a hoard of treasure, stolen from his people. He swore he would not just escape Makoko. He would plunder the wealth of those who lived in gilded cages and force it back into the communities they ignored. He would become a bigger monster than them all, but he would do it for the right reasons. It was a promise forged in grief and rage, the blueprint for the double life he would one day lead. His first heist was clumsy, brutal, and terrifyingly effective. The target was a Lebanese gold merchant known for his illegal smuggling and contempt for the locals. Adebayo, now 22, was no longer a boy. He had gathered a small crew of equally desperate, angry young men from his community. They were armed with rusted machetes and a single, ancient pistol. They stormed the merchant's compound under the cover of a torrential downpour, their hearts pounding in a rhythm of fear and adrenaline. It was messy. People were hurt. But they escaped with a fortune beyond their wildest dreams. That night, huddled in a shack as the rain hammered on the tin roof, Adebayo made the rules. A portion of the money was divided amongst the crew. The rest, the lion's share, was put aside. It was not for cars or women, he declared, but for the project. The next day, he used a fraction of the stolen cash to buy a fleet of fishing boats for the men in his community, telling them it was an anonymous donation. He saw the hope in their eyes, the first fruits of his dark pact. He had tasted power, not just the power of violence, but the power to change lives. It was intoxicating. The Oga at the top, the phantom benefactor, was born. Funk arrived at the Adebayo mansion 10 years ago, a timid, wide-eyed girl clutching a letter of recommendation from her village pastor. She had come to Lagos seeking work to support her family, expecting a life of drudgery and anonymity. What she found was Chief Adebayo. During her interview, he didn't just look at her resume, he looked at her. He asked about her family, her dreams. He spoke with a gentleness that disarmed her completely. He saw not just a potential maid, but a person. She was hired on the spot. Her loyalty was cemented within the first year. When her younger brother was accepted into university but couldn't afford the fees, Funk was prepared to sell the last piece of her family's land. Overhearing her tearful phone call, the chief had simply summoned her to his study the next day. An envelope with the full tuition fees was waiting on his desk. A family that values education is a family that will prosper, he had said with a warm smile. Consider it an investment in Nigeria's future. From that moment, her devotion to him was absolute. He was a saint, and she was his humble, grateful disciple, blissfully unaware of the true source of his divine generosity. I needed someone pure. Adebayo's voice was fading, becoming thin and reedy. Detective Ibrahim leaned closer, straining to catch every word. Someone the banks would never suspect. Someone who believed. He explained the system he had created, a masterpiece of deception built around his maid's innocence. After every major heist, the cash, sometimes hundreds of millions of naira, would be brought to the mansion. Adebayo would then give a portion to Funk, telling her it was a windfall from a recent business deal or an anonymous donation to one of his foundations. Her task was simple: deposit the cash into a labyrinth of different bank accounts. Some were for legitimate charities he did, in fact, support. Others were for shell corporations disguised as import-export businesses, construction firms, or humanitarian NGOs. To Funk, the stacks of cash and complex deposit slips were simply Oga's work. She kept meticulous records, her neat handwriting filling ledger after ledger, documenting every transaction. She was proud of her role, believing she was helping her boss do God's work. In reality, she was the clean, smiling face of a massive criminal enterprise, her innocence the perfect wash cycle for a river of dirty money. Funk remembered the day she collapsed from exhaustion and malaria. She awoke not in a cheap clinic, but in the city's most expensive private hospital, in a room filled with flowers. Chief Adebayo was sitting by her bedside. He had not only paid for the best doctors but had waited there for hours until she was stable. "You are family, Funk," he had told her, his voice thick with concern. "This house is nothing without you." It was this deep, personal kindness that made the later revelation so incomprehensible. His generosity was not an act, the concern felt real, the affection genuine. This memory, and countless others like it, formed the bedrock of her reality. He was the man who would stop his convoy to help a street vendor whose cart had overturned. He was the man who paid for the weddings and funerals of his staff, who knew the names of their children and the worries on their hearts. These were not the actions of a monster. As she meticulously tracked the funds for the Adebayo Widows Empowerment Fund or the Makoko Youth Skills Initiative, she felt a profound sense of purpose. She wasn't just a maid, she was a partner in his noble crusade to uplift the poor. The truth was that she was, but the methods of that crusade were a horror she could not yet imagine. There was a time, Adebayo confessed, a shudder running through his body, when it was clean. "We only targeted vaults, shipments. We never hurt anyone who didn't deserve it." But as his operation grew, so did the risks. He told Ibrahim about the Apapa port heist 5 years ago. The target was a container filled with undeclared diamonds belonging to a notoriously ruthless general. But the general's security was better than they'd anticipated. A firefight erupted on the chaotic docks. 2 of Adebayo's men were killed, but so was a young security guard, a boy of no more than 20, saving up for his own wedding. Adebayo remembered seeing the boy fall, his eyes wide with surprise before they glazed over. That night, for the first time, the stolen diamonds felt cold and heavy, not with value, but with the weight of a life unjustly taken. He had used the proceeds from that heist to build a state-of-the-art pediatric ward, dedicating it to the memory of his own sister. The irony was suffocating. He was saving children by creating orphans. It was the moment he looked in the mirror and saw the flicker of the very monster he had set out to destroy, the man who believed a noble end could justify any means. Detective Ibrahim listened to the dying man's tale, a silent storm of conflict raging within him. He pulled out his phone and spoke in a low, clipped voice to his deputy. "Get a team to the Ikoyi estate. Now. No sirens. I want you to secure a woman named Funk, the head maid. And I mean secure. She is not to be harmed or arrested. She is a material witness. I also want every financial document, every ledger, every computer in the chief's study." He was moving on instinct, piecing together a strategy from the fragments of a shattered legend. He had to get to Funk before the story broke, before she became a target or disappeared. At the Adebayo mansion, Funk was preparing the chief's nightly cup of chamomile tea when she heard the soft chime of the doorbell. It was too late for visitors. Puzzled, she walked to the grand, carved wooden door and opened it. Standing before her were 3 plainclothed officers, their faces grim and unreadable. They did not push past her or brandish weapons. The man in the lead simply showed her his badge. "Funk Ojo?" he asked, his voice polite but firm. "We need you to come with us. There has been an incident involving Chief Adebayo." In that instant, Funk's orderly world tilted on its axis, the first tremor of a devastating earthquake. There had been a sign, a moment of cognitive dissonance that Funk had long since buried. It was about 2 years ago. The chief had sent her to his personal garage to fetch a briefcase from his armored land cruiser. The garage was usually off-limits, the domain of his taciturn driver, but he was away. As she opened the passenger door, a heavy gym bag on the floor fell open, spilling some of its contents. Alongside a towel and a water bottle, she saw a black ski mask, a pair of heavy-duty gloves, and something that looked like the cold, metallic stock of a rifle. She had frozen, her heart slamming against her ribs. Just then, the chief had walked in, a calm smile on his face. "Ah, Funk, just tidying up some old things," he'd said smoothly, his eyes not meeting hers as he quickly zipped the bag shut. "For the annual policeman's ball charity auction. They do a mock SWAT demonstration." "Silly, I know." He had chuckled, a warm, disarming sound. Her fear had instantly subsided, replaced by a slight embarrassment for her wild thoughts. Of course, there was a simple, charitable explanation. He was Chief Adebayo. She had pushed the image from her mind, a fleeting, illogical shadow in a house filled with sunlight. Funk sat in the chief's opulent study, the very room where she had received so much kindness, now feeling like a gilded cage. The police officers were polite but firm, standing silently by the door. Then, Detective Ibrahim walked in. His face was heavy with a weariness that seemed to seep into the room. He didn't treat her like a suspect. He pulled up a chair and spoke to her softly, his voice full of a strange, paternal pity. He started by telling her the chief had been gravely injured, that there had been a robbery. Funk's hands flew to her mouth, a gasp of horror escaping her. "Funk," Ibrahim said, his eyes holding hers. "The chief, he was not the victim of the robbery." He paused, letting the impossible statement hang in the air. "He was part of it." Funk stared at him, a nervous laugh bubbling in her throat. That's not possible. You are mistaken. Oga is a good man. But Ibrahim continued, gently laying out the skeleton of Adebayo's confession, his dual life, the source of the funds she had so diligently deposited. With every word, a new crack appeared in the foundation of her world. The kind benefactor, the loving father figure, the saint of the slums, the entire image began to dissolve, revealing a terrifying stranger she had served, admired, and loved for a decade. In the warehouse, as the sirens drew so close they seemed to be inside his own head, Adebayo's breathing grew fainter. He clung to Ibrahim's arm, his eyes burning with a final, desperate need to be understood. You see a monster, don't you, detective? He wheezed. And you are right. But what do you call the men who steal pension funds and let old women starve? What do you call the ministers who divert hospital funds and let children die of treatable diseases? They wear fine suits and give speeches. I wore a mask and carried a gun. Is the method really what separates us? He argued with the passion of a man defending his very soul. He spoke of the rigged system, the courts that could be bought, the laws designed to protect the powerful. His way, he claimed, was a purer form of justice. It was a direct redistribution of wealth, a violent correction to a violent system. The school I built in Ajagunal has educated over 3,000 children, he whispered, his voice laced with fierce pride. The clinic in Mushin has saved hundreds of lives. Yes, my hands are covered in filth, detective. But I used that filth to build something clean for my people. Can your lawful men say the same? It wasn't an excuse. It was his gospel, the dark creed he had lived and was now dying by. News traveled fast, not the official report of a botched robbery, but the garbled, panicked whispers that filter through communities. Chief Adebayo has been shot. Oga is in trouble, in Makoko, the community he had risen from and never forgotten, a hush fell over the bustling waterfront market. Women stopped haggling, fishermen pulled in their nets, and people began to gather in small, anxious groups. He was more than a benefactor to them, he was their king, the one powerful man who had never forgotten them, who spoke their language and understood their struggles. They didn't know the source of the money, only its effect. They saw the new water purification plant that had halved the cases of cholera. They saw their children in crisp new uniforms, heading to the school he had built brick by brick with donations from his foreign partners. To them, his wealth was a blessing from God, and he was the vessel. As the rumor of his death began to circulate, a collective moan of grief rose from the stilted homes. They were mourning their savior, their provider, their proof that one of their own could conquer the world. They were mourning a saint, blissfully unaware of the sinner who had made their salvation possible. Detective Ibrahim drove back to headquarters as the sun began to rise, painting the Lagos sky in hues of orange and gray. Adebayo was dead. His confession, recorded on Ibrahim's phone, was a political and legal bomb. It implicated not just the chief but hinted at a network that touched the highest echelons of power. The law was clear. Adebayo was a murderer, a thief, a crime lord. His assets should be seized, his legacy dismantled as a criminal enterprise. It was an open and shut case, the biggest of Ibrahim's career. Yet, Adebayo's final words echoed in his mind. Can your lawful men say the same? Ibrahim had spent his life upholding a system he knew was deeply flawed. He had seen criminals walk free on technicalities while the innocent rotted in jail. He had seen stolen billions vanish into the pockets of the powerful with no consequences. Adebayo had bypassed that broken system. He was a monster, yes, but had his monstrosity, funded by violence and theft, ironically created more tangible good for the common man than the entire state apparatus? For the first time in his career, Detective Ibrahim felt the rigid black and white lines of the law blur into an unsettling, morally ambiguous gray. For hours, Funk sat in the study with Detective Ibrahim and a forensic accountant. They laid out the ledgers she had so carefully maintained. But now, the accountant drew lines, connecting the dots. The massive cash deposit she made on a Monday was linked to a brutal robbery of a bullion van on the preceding Friday. The Swiss Humanitarian Fund she transferred millions to was a known shell company used for laundering money. The names she had seen as beacons of hope were exposed as instruments of crime. Each transaction, the accountant explained, was like a physical blow. The money for her brother's education? It likely came from the same heist where a security guard had been killed. The funds for her mother's surgery? Perhaps from the terrorized family of a diamond merchant. Her entire life, her sense of purpose, her deep gratitude, it was all built upon a foundation of violence and suffering. She looked at her own neat handwriting in the ledgers, the careful sums and dates, and felt a wave of nausea. She had not just been a maid. She had been the bookkeeper for a monster. Her hands, which she had always believed to be clean, felt irrevocably stained. As Chief Adebayo's life ebbed away in the dusty warehouse, his final conscious thought was not of the empire he had built or the enemies he had made. It was of Funk's face, her trusting eyes, her innocent smile. His entire confession, he realized, was not for God or for the law. It was for her. By painting himself as the sole architect of the entire scheme, by emphasizing her complete ignorance, he hoped to build a firewall of truth around her. He had used her innocence as a tool for his crimes. His last act would be to use his guilt as a shield for her protection. He hoped his prayer would be answered, that she would find it in her heart to forgive the unforgivable deception. He knew he had corrupted her world, even if she was unaware, but he prayed his final words would be enough to spare her from the legal consequences of his sins. He had destroyed so much to build his legacy, but as he took his last breath, his only concern was for the one good, pure thing in his life that he had almost destroyed without a second thought. As the darkness claimed him, a single, final whisper escaped his lips, a name that was both a prayer and an apology: Funk. 6 months later, the city of Lagos was still grappling with the fallout of the Adebayo revelation. He was a paradox, simultaneously reviled as a violent criminal and mourned as a benevolent saint. The government had seized his assets, but the legal battles were fierce, as communities fought to keep the schools and hospitals he had built. His name was a ghost, haunting every conversation about wealth, crime, and justice in Nigeria. Funk had been cleared of all charges, Adebayo's detailed confession having served its final purpose. But she was not the same person. The trust in her eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. She had left Lagos, returning to her village. One afternoon, she stood before the new community clinic, the one Chief Adebayo had funded last year. Children played outside, their laughter echoing in the air, alive and healthy because of his blood money. From a distance, in an unmarked car, Detective Ibrahim watched her. He had closed the case, but not the questions in his own mind. He looked at the clinic, at Funk, and at the horizon, forever contemplating the impossible legacy of Chief Adebayo, the monster who, in his own twisted way, had tried to be a savior.